Keelhauling has ancient roots, with the earliest known accounts stretching back to the days of the Greek and Roman navies. In these early times, the Greeks practiced a similar form of punishment, primarily for acts of severe disobedience or mutiny among sailors. While it wasn't officially known as keelhauling back then, records from the ancient Greeks reveal that offenders were sometimes bound and dragged underneath the hull of the ship as a lesson to others. The Romans later adopted variations of this punishment for naval discipline, but it wasn't until centuries later that keelhauling evolved into the brutal form we recognize today. The formalization of keelhauling as a maritime punishment emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries among European naval forces, especially the Dutch and British. Dutch naval law, in particular, allowed keelhauling as a legal punishment, and it became known as a way to deal with serious offenses like mutiny, desertion, and even minor infractions if the captain saw fit. The practice was soon adopted by other navies and seafaring nations, as it proved to be a highly effective form of control and a stark warning to any crew considering insubordination. For pirates, whose very lives were based on breaking laws and living outside traditional naval rules, keelhauling was adopted as a means of enforcing their own brand of discipline. Pirate captains, eager to prevent any hint of mutiny or betrayal, would threaten or even carry out keelhauling on disobedient crew members. Keelhauling was both physically and mentally excruciating. The condemned pirate or sailor would first be stripped down and bound with ropes, securing the arms and legs tightly. Then, the crew would lower them over the side of the ship and drag them under the keel, the very bottom of the ship that's often covered with barnacles, sharp shells, and debris. These barnacles and shells, hardened by years at sea, would act like a coarse grater against the person's exposed skin. As the pirate was dragged along the ship's hull, these rough surfaces would tear into their flesh, leaving deep wounds. Many victims lost large portions of skin, muscle, and even limbs if they were dragged too slowly or roughly. The pressure of being submerged also brought a constant risk of drowning. Execution Dock was a real place in Wapping, London, a site specifically designated for the execution of pirates and other maritime criminals. For centuries, England's laws allowed the Admiralty, the institution responsible for enforcing naval law, to bring pirates to justice through harsh, public punishment. But since piracy took place at sea, trials and punishments often didn't fall under ordinary legal jurisdictions. This led to the Admiralty establishing Execution Dock as a specific location for these trials, ensuring that justice would be served in full view of the public. The dock was used as far back as the 16th century and continued to be used well into the 18th century, during the golden age of piracy. It served as a final destination for some of the most notorious pirates, who were brought from all over to face a slow and painful end. At Execution Dock, a special wooden scaffold was set up on the shoreline. This wasn't an ordinary hanging. It was done with maritime rope, a thicker, coarser rope designed to ensure a slower, more torturous death. The pirate would be forced to stand on the edge, looking out at the river, just moments before they were hanged. Unlike traditional hangings, where the fall could break a person's neck instantly, hangings at Execution Dock were deliberately slow. The pirate was left to strangle to death, often taking several minutes to die, as the rope gradually cut off their air supply. To make the punishment even more horrifying, the bodies of the most infamous pirates were left to dangle over the Thames for a time. For particularly notorious pirates, death at Execution Dock wasn't the end. After the hanging, their bodies were often tarred and bound in iron cages called gibbets, then displayed along the banks of the Thames or near port cities. The bodies, exposed to the elements and visible to passing ships, would hang for months or even years, rotting and decaying in plain view. One well-known victim was Captain William Kidd, a pirate whose name still echoes in tales of high seas adventure. When he was hanged at Execution Dock in 1701, the crowds witnessed his final moments and saw firsthand the consequences of his piracy. Marooning, a slow death of isolation. Marooning originated as a punishment in the early days of piracy, likely inspired by sailors' fear of being abandoned at sea. Pirates would maroon their own crew members as a way to punish severe crimes, especially betrayal. If a pirate was found guilty of mutiny, stealing from the crew, or defying the captain's authority, marooning was often seen as a fitting retribution. The marooned pirate was stripped of weapons and supplies, sometimes given only a single bottle of water and a pistol with one shot. a grim choice between death by starvation or a quick escape through suicide. Marooning was a cold and calculated punishment. A crew would take the condemned pirate to a small, uninhabited island or sandbar, where survival was nearly impossible. They would be forced off the ship, often in chains, and left on the shore as the ship sailed away. The worst part of marooning wasn't immediate death, but the prolonged suffering, days or even weeks alone, waiting for either starvation or a passing ship that might never come. But the story of Captain Edward Lowe, who marooned one of his men after a mutiny attempt, also illustrates how cruel this punishment could be. Flogging, the lash of discipline. Flogging was borrowed from traditional naval practices, where discipline was enforced through corporal punishment. In pirate culture, where order was often hard to maintain, flogging became the go-to punishment for crimes ranging from minor disobedience to theft or even drunkenness on duty. A captain would order flogging as a way to send a message to the entire crew. Misbehavior would not be tolerated, and the price was a painful reckoning. Flogging was brutal in its simplicity. The guilty pirate would be tied to the ship's mast, stripped of his shirt, and flogged with a whip made of knotted leather or a cat of 9 tails. A whip with 9 separate cords, each tipped with sharp knots or pieces of metal. The number of lashes varied based on the offense, but was always severe enough to inflict deep cuts and lasting scars. Each lash tore into the skin, leaving bloody welts, and sometimes leading to infections or even death from the sheer trauma. The wooden cage, a slow, public torture. The wooden cage punishment is rooted in medieval justice, where public humiliation was often a part of punishment. However, by the age of piracy, this method had evolved into a form of brutal torture and a public display of justice. Pirates who had betrayed their crew, mutinied, or committed heinous crimes were sometimes subjected to the wooden cage. This punishment was not only about killing but about setting an example and letting the pirate's slow death serve as a warning. The condemned pirate would be placed in a small wooden cage, usually on a high platform or even suspended from a dock or a tree. The cage was just large enough to hold the body, but cramped enough to prevent movement, forcing the pirate into uncomfortable positions. Once locked inside, they were left without food or water, exposed to the scorching sun, cold nights, and whatever weather came their way. Caged pirates would suffer for days, even weeks, slowly starving and often losing their sanity before they finally succumbed. Being caged wasn't just physically painful, it was mentally shattering. The pirate, trapped and unable to move, could only watch as the world carried on around them, helplessly awaiting death. Birds would often peck at them, and insects would swarm, intensifying the misery. The crowd that gathered would often jeer or throw things at the condemned, turning the pirate's final moments into a spectacle of shame.